already overwhelmed and frightened. Divorce is a difficult transition. It is an emotional upheaval that unleashes a multitude of issues. Frustration and anxiety grow in direct proportion to court orders, continuances, and judgments. But divorce from an abuser comes with an additional set of issues, and it can be lethal. 75% of assaults reported were made after separation or divorce. What seems like a typical high conflict divorce where emotions run high may be much more. Physical abuse is easy to detect, black and blue, right? But if the abuse is not visible, how then can you determine if the relationship is abusive? And does it make a difference? It's important to understand the various intricacies of domestic abuse in order to recognize the traumatizing impact it has not only on the client, but on you as well. Asking the right questions, having an awareness of the characteristics of abused women, and understanding how abusers can manipulate the court system and how re-traumatizing this is for women who have been abused will be useful tools in helping your client and can affect your legal strategy. Domestic abuse is a pattern of abusive behavior for the sole purpose of manipulating an intimate partner. It is not caused by stress, substance abuse, her behavior, loss of income, or the coronavirus. It follows a repetitive cycle and has a cumulative and traumatic effect. There are three phases. There's the tension building phase. This can be a few hours, days, or months. This is when a woman tries to figure out, what can I do different so that there isn't a blow up? The second phase is where the abusive incident occurs. This is where the abuser lashes out, denies a woman necessities, or threatens her. This is when she may say, I'm leaving. I want a divorce. This is when she may call you. She may even give you a retainer to begin the divorce process. But now comes the third phase. This is the honeymoon phase. This is when the abuser may apologize, make promises, buy gifts, so that maybe she will stay. So then she begins to rationalize, and she thinks everything is fine now. And that's when you never hear from her again. However, once this phase is over, the tension begins again. On again, off again behavior with intermittent reinforcement. This is a form of brainwashing. Regardless of the severity of the abuse, survivors suffer a loss of security and feelings of helplessness. This type of trauma can cause upsetting emotions and memories and anxiety that will not go away. Clients have reported physical symptoms as well: fatigue, insomnia, nightmares, racing heartbeats. Some have trouble functioning and working at home. They get stuck in their story, right? It is not the actual event, but the emotional experience of the event. They are more frightened and helpless and feel more traumatized. Trauma symptoms can typically last for a few days to a few months and may gradually fade away. The problem with domestic abuse is that it's ongoing. So just when you think everything is okay, it happens again. Once a divorce is over, she has that same false sense, only to be back in court post-decree to fight what was already decided in court. The cycle continues. So it makes sense how the past and the continued abuse is a risk factor for developing PTSD. And that can alter a survivor's ability to function. And you'll hear a little bit more later on about how trauma affects these women from Nancy. So domestic violence is often misunderstood unless the right questions are asked. Take a short history of the marriage, her family and his family, because remember, domestic abuse is often learned and it's intergenerational. Ask about how child-related and religious and financial decisions are made. Ask what it's like when they disagree or they argue. Ask her if she has an equal voice. How were issues resolved? Were you ever afraid for yourself or your children? Are you afraid now? This is the defining question. And if you get nothing out of this from me talking to you, a talking head, this is the most important thing to take away. The question is, when did this begin? Hiding assets and money and manipulating her and the children began long before the advent of the divorce. If you have a better grasp of the situation, you will be able to help her in the way you want, and she can become an active participant in the process. Refer her to a therapist. She should have a place to de-escalate and deal with her fear and anger and anxiety. Women and men do significantly better, and you will too. So what is she like? All right, she's a survivor. She's managed to survive an abusive relationship for many years. But at this point, when you see her, she has run out of coping strategies. She is terribly fearful that he is going to make good on his threats, that she will lose the children, her home, her finances, maybe her life. She's afraid the abuse will escalate, that he will drag the process out and use the court system to continue the control. She's fearful because he's an attorney, and many of our clients are married to attorneys, and he will represent himself. She's fearful that he will alienate the children, and she's very embarrassed that this could happen to someone like her. And she's worried that you will see her as privileged and not be believed. She's possibly depressed, unfocused, and confused, or she can be very aggressive, angry, yelling at you, telling you how to do your job. Many of the women are intimidated by you, and they may feel re-traumatized by the stressful complexities of the legal process. Most of all, she's confused when the abuse is trivialized and she is told it's not relevant to tell a judge. She is afraid that her abuser will use any mental health issues as leverage in court, and she feels trapped and powerless and wonders if she will ever be free. She is depleted, and yet she has finally found the courage to leave. So what does she expect of you, right, and the court system? Well, she expects to be rescued. You're going to be her champion. She expects vindication, that when the judge hears about what's happening, he's going to rule in her favor, he or she. She expects justice, at least fairness. I play fair, why doesn't he play fair? She expects protection, that he will be held accountable and thrown in jail if he does not comply with court orders. She expects immediate results, and she expects to be believed and respected, and for you and the judge to understand what she's experiencing. High expectations. Here's what you experience. Women who have lived through years of ongoing trauma, who don't process what they hear in a crisis, who are angry with you for normal court proceedings, who want to talk endlessly about abusers and how what he's done lately and how the children are being affected. You experience women who are terrible witnesses for themselves. They're overly emotional, or they're devoid of emotion and can't advocate for themselves. You experience women who call you over and text you with no boundaries, who don't follow up on an order of protection or what you have asked them to do. You experience women who have revolving attorneys because they don't get their expectations met, and they sound irrational, emotional, unfocused, confused, overwhelmed, anxious, depressed, frightened, and paranoid. So this is when you also feel exhausted, overwhelmed, frustrated, angry, and sometimes traumatized and abused. This is your cue to ask yourself, is this a typical adversarial divorce, or is this an abusive one? So what can you do? Believe her. Try not to judge her. Respect the fact that she may change her mind many, many times. This is common for abused women, as you heard. Discuss her expectations and yours. Be upfront about phone protocol, court procedure, length of process. Ask the right questions, because if there's a history of abuse, you will have a much better idea of what you're dealing with. And refer her for therapy where she or he can learn to deal with their emotions. One more piece here of what abusers are like. Abusers insist on more time with their children and then leave them with babysitters. They objectify their children as possessions or objects, profess their love, yet talk disparagingly about their mother, manipulate parenting time, and don't pay child support. They refuse therapy for their children and find fault with the ones that they have. They do not feel responsible for negative consequences of their behavior. Abusers rarely will compromise. They are masters of deception and really do well on psychological exams. I'm going to leave you with just a few words from a client, and this is what she said. Her name is Janet. I was told to show up whenever needed, stick to the point, use emotions appropriately, and don't talk about the abuse. Though I was emotionally depleted and immobilized by feelings of inadequacy and grief, I had to understand what I was told. Make decisions, follow through, make a good witness for myself, and prove that I'm a friendly parent and with an appropriate demeanor. And when the divorce was over, I got to go back to court to fight for what was already decided upon. And with that, I will leave you with that. And now I'm going to call upon Nancy.
Hey, everybody. I am going to share my screen so that we can look at the PowerPoint. Just checking, you got the PowerPoint up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about ACEs, and not only the trauma, but also resiliency, or what you do after the trauma. The thing about what I'm going to present is it is much broader than just the abuse that our clients have experienced. It really goes back to childhood, and for all of us, this hopefully will be informative and helpful. We will take questions. I have a lot of material to cover, so we'll try and keep questions to the end, but please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. There may be a time in here where I'll need to take a break just to, because this is a really rough topic, so we'll just keep going. All right, let's talk about ACEs. Okay, let's see, I gotta do this. There we go. So first, let's talk about the children. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Children, of course, find ways to screen out conflict. They have different ways, but even if you think they're not listening, they didn't hear, we never fight in front of the children, there is a scientific word for that. It starts with a B, has an S in the middle, and a T at the end. Children do take it in, both in terms of intellectually, but also in their bodies, in their brains. and we're going to talk about that. So let's start with the idea of, in family law, we know, we think about, we're always aware of the idea of neural integration and attachment, right? So neural integration is really healthy and secure attachment. What does that mean? When we say a child is well bonded to mom or attached to mom or dad, the idea is that you're looking at both the mind in terms of the brain and the relationships. And impaired integration can have the effect of, as the child grows up, and we see this in adults all the time, is psychological rigidity. Or we see people who have just chaos in their lives at every turn, and you cannot believe somebody has that many things that go wrong in their lives. Often, if you look back at their childhoods, they have a whole plethora of ACEs that have impacted how their brains developed and how they attach and integrate information within their brains. So your mind monitors and modifies what you need, usually without you even knowing it, okay? When you're looking at a sunset, you can focus on one part of the sky and you don't necessarily see the whole thing, or maybe you back up and see the whole picture. That's how your brain works in a very simplistic way. Of looking at how the brain controls what you pay attention to and what stimuli really get in and what you screen out. And when we're talking about relationships and attachment, we're really talking about the way we share information. Where you focus your attention stimulates neurons in your brain, and that creates connectivity, especially in young children, where the brain is still developing. So the neurons that fire together, wire together. If there is impairment in the wiring of the brain, in the neural network, then that is going to impact how you perceive information and how you deal with it. So we'll talk more about this as we go forward. In a well-integrated brain, you are balancing your emotions. You are looking for ways to solve problems. You have the internal ability to extinguish fear if it's appropriate, if the fear is overblown. You have the ability to stop, think about things. But if the neural network is impaired, you may not actually have that ability. And we could talk about insight, empathy, morality. This book, The Developing Mind, is a really great resource. Let's see if I can, Alt Tab. No, I've got to be on this screen, Alt Tab. No, it doesn't want to do it. Okay, never mind. Now I've got to go back here. Okay, but this book, The Developing Mind, is a nice little book to read about what that looks like and how the brain is impacted by what happens in development. So what happens in a high conflict divorce? There is like neural disintegration, sometimes as a result of current trauma, sometimes as a result of childhood trauma. So in a secure attachment situation, when we're doing guardian ad litem work or child rep work, or those of you who are therapists, when in your therapeutic practice, you're looking for clues or cues that there is a secure attachment. So when child falls down and gets a boo-boo, who does she go to? Does she get soothed by that parent or that caregiver? When there is abuse or fear, when there's conflict, the child wants that protection, but is also fearful. So that's a conflict. And with conflict, the part of the brain that is the amygdala, the what's sometimes called the reptilian brain, the reactive brain, gets activated. and fear is generated. When there's repeated conflict, you're really looking at that brainstem, that amygdala keeps getting triggered constantly. When there is fear without repair, without comfort, without soothing, that sensitizes those fear circuits so that they're more easily triggered and they don't calm down. They continue to control the brain and take over the functions that would otherwise be handled by the prefrontal cortex, where reasoning and judgment come into play. And so it is more likely that in the future, that person will interpret events as terrifying when they're not. So sometimes when we're dealing, especially with children, but also we see this in abuse situations where a client or a child will say, and then this happened, and wasn't that terrible? And as you look at it, you say, well, that's not really that terrible. Why is that provoking such a response in this person? And the reason is because they've never been able to separate or relieve the tension of the triggering of the amygdala. And so they are constantly looking at things through that lens. And the re-triggering happens much sooner and much stronger than it otherwise would. So that, ultimately leads to a shaping of the personality in a child that can have impacts. And often we know that the abusers that we deal with often had abuse in their families growing up. So they are really victims of this same cycle of abuse that is carried out as an adult. So if you've got a kid afraid of dad yelling, afraid of mom talking bad about dad, they're disconnecting so that they don't have to take in all that stimulus, and they're not getting soothed. So they're constantly in conflict and torment. And that leads to difficulties in the child. They could act out, they shut down, different actions from that. Think of this emotional harm could even be like a dripping faucet. It's subtle. You don't see, there's no big events, there's no big explosions. The child hasn't been physically harmed, but that drip, drip, drip of the conflict and the inability to soothe or find soothing ends up, creating long-term harm. So then let's talk about the relationship between that high conflict and trauma that is the centerpiece of our presentation today. When we talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about things that affect more than 60% of adults in this country. ACEs can include abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, financial, neglect. It could be abuse that happens in the family. It could be mental illness, substance abuse. Divorce is an ACE, is a adverse childhood experience. Jail in a family member. The ACEs produce stress, which becomes toxic when it's strong, frequent, or prolonged. It activates the body's stress response. If there is no buffering, if there's no supportive adult relationship to calm and soothe the child. That biologic response, it's actually a physical, biological response, not just a thinking situation, is a lifetime impact. And it's very likely that your clients have experienced some ACEs and are more reactive to adult traumatic events than they would have been had they not had those ACEs. And keep in mind, we'll talk a little bit later about our own ACEs and our own experiences that lead to our reactions to these things. So in 1998, there was a study done by the National Institutes of Health that, and it's been supported, and there's been all kinds of research about it since, that showed that childhood trauma is very common, even in privileged, employed, white, middle-class, college-educated people with health insurance and resources. And that there's a direct link between childhood trauma and adult onset of chronic disease, actual physical disease, heart, diabetes, obesity, and then emotional, mental illnesses like depression, suicide, violence, and being a victim of violence. There are the more types of trauma that somebody experienced as a child, there is an increased risk of health, social, and emotional problems. That is a proven correlation.
Mhm.
Most people have experienced at least one trauma, and maybe more than one. As your ACEs score increases, the risk of disease and social and emotional problems increase. So we divide ACEs into really 10 types of problems. 5 of them are categorized as personal. These are things that happen to you: physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect. The other 5 are things that happened elsewhere in the family, but that impact the child. A parent who's an alcoholic, if a parent is the victim of domestic violence. In this slide, it says mother is victim of domestic violence. I go back to what Vicki said at the beginning. We know that men are also victims of domestic violence, and it would have the same kind of impact. A parent who's mentally ill, jailed, or divorce, especially if the parent removes themselves from or gets removed from the family system. Death, abandonment as well. So as ACEs increase, health risks increase. And this is what the studies have shown. All of these physical, mental, and behavioral impairments are frequently associated or correlated with high ACEs scores. You can look at the slide, it's in your materials, but it's these are so common that it's scary. We're not talking about just a few people who are impacted by this, or just those people and not people just like us. So I'm gonna do a little test here. You're all gonna get tested. You get to figure out what your own ACEs score is. So think about while you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, you're going to give yourself a point for each of these ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Did a parent or other adult in your household often swear, insult, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? If yes, give yourself a point. Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, slap, grab, slap, or throw something at you, hit you? Did you have marks or were injured by it? Another point. Did an adult give you, ever touch or fondle you in a sexual way or try to have sex with you? Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? That your family didn't look out for each other or feel close or support each other? Did you often feel you didn't have enough to eat or had to wear dirty clothes, no one to protect you? Your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you were sick? Were your parents ever divorced or separated? All of our clients' kids get one of those points.
Mhm.
Was a mother or stepmother ever pushed, slapped, grabbed, kicked, bitten, so on? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic who used street drugs? By the way, the one before that, number 7, it does refer to the mother, and there's a reason for that in the literature. But obviously, if a father was treated the same way, there would be an impact. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill or attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? Now add up your answers. If you had any ACEs, that is significant. If you had more than 5 ACEs, that's quite significant. If you had more than 7, check yourself in. No, that's considered a high ACE score. So let's talk about brain growth. Obviously, the future of any society depends on its ability to foster the next generation. Research now shows that the brain development is impacted by these stress responses. The toxic stress, and toxic being stress that's not ameliorated or continues for a long period of time, has damaging effects on not just behavior, but also learning and health throughout your lifespan. It can be in a single experience, it can be repeated. Trauma, as we define it here, is really looking at 3 common elements. Something that's unexpected. You're not prepared for it, and there's nothing you can do to stop it from happening. And it's that loss of control that then leads to people who experience that as children becoming abusers as adults, because we know that abuse is about control. It's not about anger. It's not about anger management. It's about the desire to control. And how you experience it determines whether that is going to impact you or not. So it can be common occurrences. It can take serious emotional toll without seeing any signs. The kids are fine. They're handling this divorce just fine. I don't see any problems here. Well, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't have a profound impact. So what are the responses to trauma? Well, when the amygdala gets stimulated, we're really talking about then those kind of prehistoric responses: fight, flight, or freeze. You see the saber-toothed tiger, what do? So when we're talking about fight, flight, or freeze, I divide it into, not just me, but some of the literature as well, into really 2 different categories. Fight or flight, those are 2 sides of the same coin. There has to be some hope. You have to think that you can influence the outcome. You can outrun the saber-toothed tiger, or you can beat up the saber-toothed tiger. You can kill it first before it kills you. You have to have some hope. The freeze response really happens when you are overwhelmed and perceive that there is no hope. I cannot outrun this tiger. I cannot beat and kill this tiger. I am screwed. And what happens then is literally the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system tells your body to relax. Just sit, don't move, don't take any action. And really what happens is that you might mentally remove yourself from the situation, disassociate, and that could lead to long-term health problems as well, mental health problems. So there are many different types of trauma, of traumatic stress. For little kids, there's often, there may be intentional violence, there may be natural disasters, wars, accidents, a caretaker dies, a grandparent, or another loved one, a parent. In the situation of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, There could be violence between the adults with whom the child has a relationship, and the child is exposed to that. They rely on the parent to be the strong person, to be the protector. And if that parent cannot protect themselves, that puts the child in a position of not being able to trust their own trust in that parent. Neglect, of course, in serious cases of neglect that are abuse, we expect there to be a traumatic response, but it's even not being able to protect yourself or your child from abuse that can be considered neglect. And then there are all kinds of complex traumas that really pile on that traumatic toxic stress response. And without the ability to detect or respond to danger cues, because you don't know what's happening, you don't know when it's going to happen, and you can't control it, it keeps people on edge and stimulates triggers that amygdala response. And that impacts how the brain develops. We have learned that the brain neural network actually stops growing as fast.
Where did this go?
I'm sorry? Barbara, are you not seeing? Okay, I'm sorry. If somebody isn't seeing the picture, put it in the chat. Children are looking to parents to learn how to regulate themselves. And if mom or dad cannot regulate themselves, then they don't know how to do it either. So we all need to understand that the trauma derails a child's development and actually impairs the development and may set back the development of the neural network. So why should we learn about ACES and family law? When we understand trauma, when we demonstrate to our clients that we understand it, they are more likely to share relevant information with us. They trust us. We can help clients engage and create their own goals and make progress to that and buy into the system. Very often we have clients who in that system of abuse say, well, nobody's going to help me and I don't care what happens, and this whole system is rotten. Well, it may be, but that doesn't help them very much. They need to buy in to having goals and being able to work towards them. And it does take more of our time to prepare a client who's experienced ACEs for things like dispute resolution process, like mediation. And for court can be a re-traumatizing event for a client. And when you are acknowledging where they are with that, you are enabling them to help you help them as best as they can. So it's really important that we design as much as possible our policies, our procedures, our office environments back, in the olden days when we had offices to see clients in, and hopefully someday we will again. We want clients to share information with us. We want them to feel like they have a right to self-determination if they are able to take on that role. One thing to understand, and I have stopped myself from doing this, it's very common for us to tell our clients, oh, your case is not the worst, I've seen another case that was worse, or boy, that's really bad, but I've had other cases and here's what some other clients have been through. That experience can re-traumatize them and also minimize their own feelings and make them feel like you're comparing and they're not as bad. So don't re-trigger them and keep to a minimum what you do with that. other stories. Sometimes it's good to help them normalize their feelings and their responses, but don't get into comparisons. I loved this thought. If you can express to clients that this is a chapter in your life, this is part of your journey. How many pages do you want in this chapter? Do we want to stay here, or do we want to move on to the next chapter? So when you interview clients who have been through traumatic experiences, you want to do it with a trauma-informed lens. That trauma-informed lens helps to make them feel heard and open up a little bit. Their experience may be somewhat abnormal, like, whoa, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. But their response to the experience is very normal. And sometimes it helps to normalize or help them understand their responses, or get them to a therapist who can do that with them. It's really key that we respect their boundaries and privacy, especially if they've been in an abusive relationship where they had to really have no control over any of that, and to ask permission to move to the next topic, or to ask permission to look at other options, those kinds of things. And of course, one thing that's really important is that idea of hope. It helps to have clients understand that there is hope on the other side of this process. It may not be as good as it, a perfect world, but they will have more control over themselves and their family. They will potentially have more control over their finances. There are a lot of things that you can focus on, or help them focus on, to let them know that it can get better. Just some little minor tips. Let the client sit not with their back to the door, but facing the door. Let the client know when you're writing down notes that you're not doing any judging of them. There's nothing in your notes, especially if you're the child's rep or GAL, in a situation like this where you're not making judgments about them. I'm just putting down a few key facts. I'm not writing down anything judgmental about you. Really being transparent with your client. Give them lots of information. Help them understand the court process. What does a motion call look like? What's a status date? Why don't they need to be there? What's a pretrial? What's going to go on in that back room, or in the current situation, in that Zoom breakout room with the judge when they're not there? Help them understand it so that they're less fearful about it. And try not to, like, walk behind the client, and don't have a seating setup. Of course, in Zoom, we're all equal, but where you are sitting above the client or something like that. I know that used to be a thing. I don't know that any of us do that anymore. Give the client the ability to lead the discussion. What do you want to talk about next? What are the important issues to you? Would you like to tell me what key points you want to go over in this meeting, so that they can have some control over themselves? Your awareness of trauma-informed care is really essential to help them break that cycle. What does it look like when you're seeing trauma, or the results of trauma? There's going to be a shattered sense of safety and trust. They are not going to trust anybody, including us. We have to build that. They may have a couple of people that they trust, or they may have been so isolated they really have nobody in their lives. There's a sense of powerlessness or helplessness over their lives, and that's that hope feature that we really need to help them with. And trauma, of course, has many faces. Sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's anger, sometimes it is just detachment, and we need to recognize this. And we want to provide clients with trauma-informed care. You know, if a client starts to be angry or resistant or non-cooperative, you've asked them for those bank statements 6 times and they don't get them to you. Instead of trying to say, well, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you getting me these things? Why don't we focus on what's happened to you? What's keeping you from helping you help yourself here? I need that information so I can do a better job of you. Let me explain to you what I'm going to do with that information. They may be afraid of disclosing something, that they went to the store and they bought a $60 bra that they were never allowed to buy before, something like that. So they're not giving you those statements because they're afraid. So you have to get more information. So there's this website, sanctuaryweb.com. There's a lot of good information. And they talk about trauma-informed principles. And I've written them here so that you have them in your materials, but check out the website too. It's a nice, concise presentation of information there. So there are practice standards for trauma-informed care. You want to build relationships based on respect, trust, and safety. You want to draw on their strengths. What are they good at? What can they help you with? If they feel more comfortable expressing themselves to you, they will be a better client and a better recipient of your services. And you will be able to do more for them because you're not fighting them as well as the other side and the judge. And those coping behaviors are important to help them, to help understand them and to help them move forward in those behaviors to perhaps better and more resilient coping behaviors. I'm going to skip this slide. It's in your materials, just more of the same information. So what do we want to do in cases? How do you bring that trauma-informed lens to your cases? Well, you want to build your own knowledge and skills, recognition of all of these issues so that when they come up, you can say, oh, I know what that is. And here's my toolbox for dealing with this kind of situation. You want to establish trusting relationships if you can. You want to respect the other people in their lives, the people who are helping them. And you want to have a trauma-informed service delivery. So if you're going to send them to a therapist, or if you're going to choose a child representative or GAL in a case, or a mediator in a case, you want to choose people who will also recognize the trauma-informed lens. And, you know, you want to have an approach that realizes that widespread impact, recognizes the signs, responds appropriately, and actively resists re-traumatization. And that information comes from the government website. And it's still up. It hasn't been taken down by he who shall not be named. So this is the trauma-informed principles on the SAMHSA website. What kind of interventions can we do? Well, we want to respect them. We want to connect with them and help them be hopeful regarding their recovery from the trauma. We want to help them understand the relationship between the trauma they've experienced, whether it was as a child or currently in their relationship, and the symptoms of the trauma that they're experiencing. And you want to work in a collaborative way with them to empower them and help them be better consumers of our services. So let's shift for a moment to resiliency. What are we going to do to help both the children that we represent, the clients that we represent, but also ourselves to be more resilient? And we'll get to some of the lawyer stuff in a minute. In the context of exposure to this adversity, resilience is a capacity to navigate your way around it, to resources that will sustain your well-being. Here we all are sitting in our basements or in our home offices, not being able to go out and have social interactions, or if we do have social interactions, being nervous about people who don't have masks on and people who are too close to us and all the things that are happening now. And so you have to find resources that will help you, whether that is working jigsaw puzzles or listening to music or whatever other coping mechanisms you have yourselves, and to help your clients find what they need as well. And to negotiate for these resources. How do you ask for help? That's really hard in our society. We have such a strong emphasis on self-reliance in our society that it becomes very hard to ask for help. And especially if you have a client or you yourself have been isolated and not able to get what you need because of this repeated trauma, you have to be able to not just navigate your way to resources, but negotiate to be provided them. So I have another little questionnaire for you. And this one, we're gonna have 5 answers, potential answers, sort of a 1 through 5 scale. Definitely true, probably true, not sure, probably not true, or definitely not true. So keep track of your responses to these statements, and you'll have some clue of how resilient you are. I believe that my mother loved me when I was little. Is that a definitely true, probably true, not sure, probably not true, or definitely not true? Okay, so you'll do that for each of these questions. I believe that my father loved me when I was little. When I was little, other people helped my mother and father take care of me, and they seemed to love me. Grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, babysitters, whatever it is. I've heard that when I was an infant, someone in my family enjoyed playing with me, and I enjoyed it too. See, we're looking at childhood experiences here, because that really informs and impacts our adult lives. When I was a child, there were relatives in my family who made me feel better if I was sad or worried. When I was a child, neighbors or my friends' parents seemed to like me. When I was a child, teachers, coaches, youth leaders, ministers, rabbis were there to help me. Someone in my family cared about how I was doing in school. My family, neighbors, and friends talked often about making our lives better. We had rules in our house and we were expected to keep them. Again, definitely true, probably true, not sure, probably not true, or definitely not true. When I felt really bad as a child, I could almost always find someone I trusted to talk to. As a youth, people noticed that I was capable and could get things done. Validation, right? I was independent and a go-getter. I believed that life is what you make it. So how many of these protective factors did I have as a child and a youth? How many of these 14 were definitely true or probably true? All right, we got Everybody's got their scores now for their ACES and their scores for the resilience questionnaire. All right, go here. So the dimensions of resilience, you've got physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. So for physical, we're looking at things like fitness and stamina, your nutrition, can you rest and recover? People who have sleep disorders, insomnia, can't wake up in the morning, those kinds of things. Emotional, can you calm and focus yourself? Do you have good impulse control? Emotional regulation. Can you access positive emotions? Can you access realistic optimism as opposed to unrealistic or fantastical ideation? Mental, the mental dimension. Do you believe in yourself? What's your outlook and perspective? Can you be positive? Do you get into what are sometimes called thinking traps, you know, those cycles where you keep falling into the pit because you keep doing the same things over and over, thinking the same way? I can't do it. I'll never be able to do it. It's not going to be the something that I can ever accomplish, those kinds of things. And also spiritual. Do you have values and belief? Are you capable of empathy? Can you reach out to other people and provide them with a realistic opportunity? So, you know, this whole cycle, these different dimensions, you may have better or stronger skills in one area than the other, but you really need to have a balance for complete well-being. So the single most common factor for children who develop resilience, even though there are ACEs, is to have at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. That is really so key. And that's part of the situation when we have contested custody battles, is which is the parent that's really going to help the child develop resilience because they are stable, committed, and supportive of that child. It's a good question sometimes. The factors in resilience, and this comes from the American Psychological Association in 2016, a paper that they produced. To have caring and supportive relationships, both inside and outside the family. Can you make realistic plans and carry them out? Can you take the steps to carry them out? Sometimes people fail on one or the other of those elements. Do they have a positive view of themselves and confidence in their own strengths and abilities? Are there skills in communication and problem solving? I have often said that the biggest shortfall of our clients who have difficult cases is their inability to problem solve. They can't find a way to get from here around, under, over, some way through the wall, and they just keep bumping into that wall without trying to figure out how to get around it. And that's a result of the trauma, both current and in childhood. And can they manage strong feelings? Yes, divorce is difficult. There's a lot of strong feelings stirred up in divorce, even in an easy divorce. But can you manage it? Can you put that in a box, so to speak, and go on with your life, or does it stop you? There are some strategies for building resilience. These are things you might want to help your client, or if you're a therapist, these are the things you're doing with your clients to help them develop resilience. And as a child rep or GAL, you might want to help the parents or help your child client to develop these skills. And to recover from trauma, you really need to enhance your ability to cope, to nurture relationships, take care of yourself. I mean, we say that all the time, but we don't do it. Or I don't do it, but a lot of us don't do it. We don't really take care of ourselves. I apologize. The sun comes in my window for like 10 minutes every day in my basement grotto here. Really being able to focus on all of the things that are on this slide are helpful in building resilience and recovering from trauma. After trauma, post-traumatic growth, this is how the individual struggles or succeeds as a result of that trauma. There are areas for significant post-traumatic growth, getting into a new relationship, whether it's a friendship or emotional significant other relationship. Part of why we tell people not to jump into a new relationship too soon is because you have to be ready for it. And there's a Ernest Hemingway quote, and I wonder if anybody knows what book this comes from. The world breaks everyone, and afterward, some are strong at the broken places. Quote's a little longer than that, but I like that part of it. It's an Ernest Hemingway quote. You can put in the Q&A which book it's from if you know, or in the chat, and we'll tell you at the end. So what are the stressors for trauma, for divorce, trauma divorce for children? Well, there's the initial stress. Mom and dad are not living together anymore, whether it's dad's living in the basement or mom's living in the spare bedroom, or they're living in separate homes. There's parental conflict about and involving the children, whether they think the children hear them or not. The kids know these things. There's a loss of a vital relationship. It may not just be mom and dad. It may be dad's extended family, mom's, the child's favorite uncle, mom's brother, those kinds of things. There may be financial stressors that come into play. We used to be able to do this. We can't do that anymore. We don't have enough money. And then there's the introduction of new partners. And certainly the introduction of serial partners, attachments that form and get broken without really regard to the child's having attached to this person. I'm not dating that guy anymore. That's great, but you allowed your child to have a relationship with this person, and now you're taking that away from them. So all of these are additional stressors and trauma experiences for the child. There are protective factors to reduce that stress. We are looking at in the family. We're looking outside the family. We're looking at the child internally. Do they have the skills within themselves? And then external, is there a supportive environment? Is there a therapist, a teacher, an outside person, a caregiver who is going to be there for this child to help them learn, manage stress management skills, to create a sense of safety and support, and maybe correct untrue ideas. No, it's not true. Daddy doesn't love you anymore. Daddy didn't leave you. Daddy left a marriage, or mom left a bad marriage. I actually get a traumatic exposure response just from this slide, because it sort of expresses how many of us feel in life these days, between COVID and being in our homes and the political situation and the loss of stimuli in relationships. But we're really talking about exhaustion, cynicism, inefficacy, and the center of that becomes burnout. And so what does that really look like? That's the traumatic exposure response. That's the transformation that occurs within us as a result of exposure, not just to our own trauma, but to other beings' trauma. Burnout occurs over a longer period of time, often related to workplace, and this traumatic exposure response really impacts us as divorce professionals. We get burnt out. We need to remember that we have our own response, trauma response to the things that go on around us, including our clients' problems. Make sure that you have enough resources to do your job. We all know about compassion fatigue, and we have had colleagues, we may ourselves experience this. You know, enough, I don't care about your problems. Your problems are not as important to me as you may think. And of course, you can't tell clients these things. And you don't want to even display those kinds of emotions, because that's not going to help us in our professional careers. But you have to be, show compassion to yourself, and that's a protective measure for yourself against traumatic exposure response. And then bearing witness to the trauma, being able to tell somebody about it, and remember your own compassion and empathy, but also your anger and cynicism, and balance the work-life balance, as we sometimes say, but the different parts of your life, be able to balance them. It can leave you feeling hopeless and helpless, or hypervigilant. You're exhausted all the time. I just can't listen to this client anymore. You get that 97th phone call from the same client with the same problems, and you tell your staff to take a message. You don't talk to them because you just can't deal with it right now. You don't have the inability to empathize. And of course, in some cases, it leads to our colleagues and ourselves sometimes having our own addictions and coping mechanisms that might not be the healthiest. Yes, it's okay to come home and have a glass of wine, but maybe having a bottle of wine after dinner or with dinner is not such a great idea. Remember your own trauma history and how you're reacting to the things that are triggering you. Don't ignore your own health. Don't take on too much. Easy to say, less easy to do. And sometimes you need to balance what kind of cases you take. It is not the end of the world to say no to a potential client, no matter how their cause triggers you. I sometimes get two reactions to needy clients who are in this trauma response cycle. Sometimes I just no, I just can't deal with that kind of thing again. I don't want to take this case. And sometimes I get that, white knight on the steed with a lance response, and I'm going to go battle, slay dragons for this client. Both of those responses are not good. And we want to be somewhere in the middle. We want to have realistic expectations of ourselves, or we create our own trauma. And sometimes you just get in a cycle, you lose 2 or 3 emotions in a row and you start to get down on yourself, and sometimes it just happens, and it's not a plot against you. Although, sometimes I think, the judges are talking, they all hate me. But, it doesn't happen all the time. I win more than I lose, but normally it's a traumatic experience for us when we lose emotion, even though it's not our lives and not our case. There are some qualities that we need to work in this business: empathy, compassion, self-awareness. You have to be able to be comfortable with the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen in somebody's life or in their case. We have to be able to accept being uncomfortable with it. Manage your own traumatic exposure response. Some ideas I put in the slide here. And be aware of addressing the traumatic exposure response. Here's ABCs: awareness, balance, and connection. If you remember nothing else, remember how to deal with it yourself by using A, B, and C. Awareness, balance, and connection. And that is my presentation. I want to give thanks. This slideshow started out in an AFCC presentation done by a judge, Chief Justice Paula Carey, and a mental health professional psychologist by the name of Peggy Ward. And I want to thank them for the ideas and the slides and all those great graphics. So now we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Barbara. That was amazing. I think I can change the viewing. Oh gosh.
Wait, let me stop sharing.
Stop sharing, and then we can do side-by-side gallery. Well, here we go. Here we all are. So one of the first things that I want to say is thank you to both of you. I think this was amazing, a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure that people got a lot out of it. I know for some people this may have been triggering, and again, I urge you, if that is the case, to either call your own mental health professional, or you can give our office a call. Obviously, Barbara can't take your call right now because she's busy with something else, but we do have wonderful people in our office, obviously, and that number is 773-583-4673. Before we start taking, I see a couple great questions, and I'm going to be putting in our survey through SurveyMonkey. I urge you to please take a minute to do an evaluation for us. It's always helpful. And we're always looking for new topics, and that question is in there as well. So if there's something that you wish we would have had more time to cover, let us know. So here we go with questions. There's some good ones here. The first is, do you have any red flags that you look for? And I think this is for both of you, because I know Barbara has some information on this as well, that you look for when you're GAL or child rep to indicate that the child has been coached. So Nancy will let you take that first. And I think that Barbara, as from a clinical point of view, Barbara, make sure, I thought I unmuted you. Can you make sure that you're, oh wait. Okay, wait, you're not.
All right.
Barbara, I think you need to unmute yourself on your end.
All done.
There you go. Perfect. I know
All right.
Barbara has a lot of things about red flags and things that GAL should be looking for. So Nancy, you start.
Okay, so here's my approach to it. They're coached, always. I always assume that they're coached. And the thing that I have to do, my task is to get beyond the coaching, to approach it in another way, to ask the question differently, to reframe what they're telling me so that maybe a little bit of the truth comes out. I just always assume that they've been coached, whether explicitly or implicitly.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to hurt mom or dad. And so they're going to be careful.
Mm-hmm. I think that children, as you said, are sponges. And so they absorb what goes on in the house. They will align themselves with the most powerful, and usually that's dad. And they may come up with all kinds of things on their own. Our clients, when there's going to be an evaluation, we will talk at great length of what they need to be talking about, that the women need to not badmouth the father, which they already know, and to just speak to what is in the best interest of the child. And I think for evaluators and child reps, this is what you need to be listening to. because I don't think you're always going to get an honest response from children, depending on the age, okay? Because they have been coached, and oftentimes by the father. And so they're very afraid, very fearful. We tell the mothers to tell them, just be you, just be yourself, be honest. It's okay. None of this is your fault. We will all still love you no matter what. So I think it's a tough position. You have to be King Solomon, and it's tough, really tough.
Yeah. Okay, another question, which is something that I know we talk about often in the office is, and it's actually a question that I had written down myself if nobody asked questions. So do the judges get this? Do judges get any training on domestic abuse? Barbara, I'll let you go first this time on that one.
They do get training on domestic abuse. I believe that it's like a couple of hour type of training. Do they understand any of the nuances? They do not. And yes, this is the bane of my existence, but I think that as lawyers, you have to do the best you can to get the judge to understand this. But keep in mind, and I understand this too, the court was not set up for these nuances. And so they immediately, bring in a guardian ad litem for the kids, an evaluator. And the problem is that most of our clients can't afford that anymore. They can barely pay their attorney, or their attorney has quit, and it just causes such havoc and panic. The greatest concern is that judges do not follow through on what they have said. So if a judge says to the husband, you need to be doing such and such by this date, and then he doesn't show up for court, and the judge gives him another continuance, in the meantime, she's tearing her hair out of her head. So the judges, if they would simply just follow through on what they have decided, that would help tremendously. And yes, the answer to that is yes, they need greater training. Absolutely.
Nancy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, actually, the slideshow that I just did, the presentation, has about a dozen or so slides that are just geared to judges and court personnel that I did not include in this presentation. It has been given to judges before. Judges go to judge school, and they are required to take domestic violence training. But I would say that they're, maybe at a third grade level in their understanding of it often, and, they get the basics. So if there are any judges out there, see, part of the problem in our state anyway is the judges have their own trainings, and they don't invite lawyers to present to them because we practice in front of them. But if there's any judges who want to do a presentation, or who want me to do a presentation, I do have a whole judge one ready to go if they ever want it.
Yeah, and I have to say that, we, our Shava lunch, we get a lot of judges actually every year, and we figure like, okay, you have to get creative with how you're getting this information out to the judges correctly, correct. So this is one way that we're able to, we do reach some family law judges through that. But yes, there is more training that clearly needs to be done. And they're judges, they're not therapists. And they're relying, like Barbara said, they're relying on other people, and they can't possibly, they've got too many cases, they can't possibly understand the facts of each case, because they've got however many cases they're dealing with in any given day. And our clients are, like Barbara said, they're frustrated. They just want help, and they're having a hard time getting it.
Yeah,
So.
and a lot of the nuance in each situation doesn't get in front of the judge because it is technically irrelevant.
Right.
And
you don't get more money just because you were abused.
That's right.
It's awful.
So there's a lot that just doesn't rise to the judge's attention. And it's a question of how do we bring it without the judge going, rolling their eyes.
Right, right. So on a little bit of a different topic, we got a couple more judge questions, and that could be a whole day. A different question is, how do you address the plight of children who appear to be victims of parental alienation? Now, this again could be a whole nother presentation, and there's two different ways of looking at parental alienation. Who wants to talk about the one that we don't believe in and the one that we do believe in? Barbara, you're smiling. Or
No,
Nancy,
no,
one of you, you can each take one.
Do
if
we
you
have
would like.
3 or 4 hours?
Yeah,
Well,
really.
let's give the quick, we can give a little down and dirty on the one that
Yeah.
doesn't exist. So Barbara, you want to start there?
The term is bantered around quite a bit. It began as a very false type of philosophy, that this was a psychological thing that was actually happening. And so the term stuck, and it can mean a lot of different things. But with abusers, what's so interesting, as I had said before, they're never at fault. So if the child doesn't want to go with them, it's the mother that's doing it, right? Forget the fact that the kid is with a babysitter, or he's not nice to the kids, or he's got 3 girlfriends there. It's the mother's fault. And so he right away will scream, this is parental alienation. She's not letting me see the kids. So she will do everything she possibly can to be this friendly parent. And the problem is that he does not. So she'll follow all the rules, and he will not follow the rules, and he will still scream, she's trying to alienate the kids from me. So it's a tough, this is where the GALs come in, and any of the evaluators come in. And I have to tell you that some of them are not educated either. So we run into that problem. Take it away, Nancy.
So I've always thought of this, and I think a better term that's used now in some of the literature is estrangement, as opposed to alienation. What we're really talking about is a 3-legged stool. There are behaviors from mom that contribute, there are behaviors from dad that contribute, and there's the child's own vulnerabilities. It's not infrequent to see a family where this is being brought up and only one of 2 children is alienated, or one of 4 children is alienated. And sometimes a child is just more susceptible because of either their own childhood traumas in that family, things got worse by the time the 4th kid was born, or because of their own psychological makeup. And so you can't really address it without really looking at all 3 legs of the stool. It's not all one or the other. And then the other thing, if I want to reference back to my presentation, if anybody was listening, is remember that very often this starts in childhood for both of the parents. And it started in childhood for their parents. And so you're dealing with very entrenched trauma responses that dad is acting this way. Why? In part because of their own traumatic childhood experiences. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you can sort of get to that and find the humanity and the desire to change and be resilient from that trauma in both parents. So that's my hopeful, optimistic view, is a trauma-informed response to that situation can sometimes lead to better outcomes.
That's great. Okay, 2 more questions, and we're running out of time. If we can stay 5 extra minutes, because I think both these questions are great, and I'd love to cover them if that's okay. And again, don't forget to do your surveys. So first question is from someone who works as an attorney, guardian ad litem, and child protection. What services and resources can I advocate for DCFS to provide my kids with to interrupt the cycle of learned violence?
Can we start with nothing you do with DCFS makes any difference whatsoever, because they don't know what they're doing. But So in child protection, the good news is because DCFS often sort of drops the ball in running the situation, as the GAL or attorney for the child, you can take the lead. And you can do that by looking at those resilience factors and trying to put some of that in place for the child. And looking at the exposure response or the trauma-informed lens that I talked about, and try to help everybody understand what's going on, what are the triggers, and how did we get here, and then how do we take it from here. So
Right.
of course, when we're talking about child protection, we're talking about things that have already gone pretty far.
Right.
For DCFS to go through with it. But
Right. So really getting those kids into therapy, into trauma-informed therapy for the child.
right. And
Right.
and hopefully if you have these materials, we did give everybody the PowerPoint, right?
Yes, I already sent it, and I'll send it out again.
A lot of that is going to give you some resources and places to look.
There's a lot, there are a lot of books listed in there and websites to look through. Barbara, did you have something to add on that one?
What do you do if the father refuses therapy for the child and, of course, for himself?
Right.
Well, if DCFS is in the case, then he doesn't get to refuse therapy for either himself or the child.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he can refuse for himself and lose parental rights, but generally speaking, DCFS gets to be the elephant that stomps around and makes people do what they want.
Okay. And one, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm not sure. Are judges required to take the PAPE training, which is the partner abuse intervention prevention training? Are they required to take that training to understand the dynamics of abuse from a man, or the CDVP training for understanding? The Certified Domestic Violence Professional training.
No.
Definitely not the CVDP.
Yeah.
They don't get
and
that
they don't have
level
to sit through a PAPE training ever either. I mean, they can if they want to, right? But that's not a requirement.
I'm not sure. There is a training. I do not know the details of it, but I know that all the judges in family law have been through a domestic violence training.
Yeah.
And at judge school that they all have to go to, there are classes in it.
Right. It's optional sometimes.
Right.
It depends on your assignment. Yeah.
Right. So, okay. I know that there are a couple more questions in here, and unfortunately I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think that I'm going to try and save this chat and get back to you. You can always email us. I'm going to put my email in here, which is simply vrifkin@shalvacares.org. And you can send me any question. Ooh, sorry, I can't even type right now because I'm trying to talk and type at the same time. But I want to make sure you have that before this all closes up. I will leave the meeting open for a few more minutes. So if you have a question that you think of as you're filling out that survey, that would be great. And I just, again, want to thank Barbara and Nancy for this wonderful discussion. We've got a lot of great feedback here. Someone asked if there's a recording. There is a recording. You won't get my beautiful introduction because I forgot to turn it on, but you will get all of Barbara and all of Nancy, which is much better than me anyway. And I think with that, I just want to say thank you again. Any last words?
No, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you all for coming.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Good luck.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.